Alright, grade 9, I hope that you are doing fine today. Today we'll continue speaking about the arts, artisans, philosophers in the Greek civilization. We have already covered many aspects of that, speak about the philosophers and the artists and also the writers. So today we'll speak about another thing, which is the literature. So before speaking about the Greek literature, is there any question about what we have already studied? Anything that you did not understand?
No.
So everything is totally okay with you and you have understood everything.
Yes.
Okay, if there is any question, anything about what we have already covered, just type it in the chat or on the discussion room. Alright, so speak today about the Greek literature. What is the meaning of literature?
What?
What is the meaning of literature?
I know it's in Arabic, but I don't know how to explain it.
Try to explain as much as you know in English. The definition of literature. What is the definition of literature?
Like art or something.
Nice. This art is seen or written?
No, seen.
Seen. Great. Okay. So, to speak about literature first, guys, you know that literature is the art of writing. How you write a concise piece of writing. Whether this piece of writing is a comprehension, a prose, poetry, a novel, a short story. All of these are called literature. And there is another type of literature which is oral literature. This one is to be spoken by the tongue, like poetry, while you narrate a poem. So that's also called literature. And as the art, we said that you will never find any civilization that is excellent or excelled in the construction, the art, the architecture of the art, unless this civilization is very developed. Consequently, any civilization will take great interest in literature once it is developed. Otherwise, they will start first by solving their problems. Yet, once all the problems are fixed, they will take great interest in arts and literature. So, in literature as an art, the ancient Greeks developed their own style. Their later Europeans, Greek style, were a model of perfection. They admired what they called the classical style. So, the early Greek people just like what they did in art. We have spoken about that in the art. They loved perfection. They needed their art to be complete, a whole. That's why they studied anatomy and they started to present the human body and muscles in their sculptures. So, in the literature also, they loved their literature to be a perfect one. Consequently, they created their own unique and distinguished style. This style was called the classical style. And of course, the classical style referring to the elegant and the balanced forms of traditional techniques of the Greek works of art. So, the Greek people just took great interest in the Greek literature as they did in the Greek arts and architecture. And as always, as elegant people, they loved perfection. They needed their literature to be perfect and complete. That's why they made their own unique style, which was later called the classical style. In this classical style, they present to us a balance of elegant work and elegant art. Early Greek literature began with the epic poems of Homer. Remember Homer? We have studied two of his poems, spoken about them, not studied them actually.
Yes.
Yeah, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yes.
So Homer is one of the great Greek poets. He wrote for us many stories, novels, and also poems. One of his great poems was the Iliad. And in the Iliad, we consider it our chief or main source of events at that era, especially about the Trojan War, whose stirring tales inspired later writers. In later times, the poet Sappho sang of love, of the beauty of her island home, while the poetry of Pindar celebrated the victories in athletic contests. So we have three main figures of the ancient Greek poets: Homer, Sappho, and Pindar. Three of them contributed widely in the literature of the early Greek civilization, and the three of them are to be considered very highly important. For the Greek tragedy, Abdurrahman, can you read, please?
Yes. Is it tragedy or tragedy?
Tragedy.
Okay. Greek tragedy. Perhaps the most important ancient Greek contribution to literature was in the field of drama. The first The first Greek plays evolved out of religious festivals, especially uh, yes,
In
especially
Athens,
those held in Athens to honor the god of fertility and wine, Dionysus.
Dionysus is the god of fertility and the god of wine. So, some of the most important Greek plays introduced to us, they represented the art of drama literature. What is the meaning of drama? What is the meaning of tragedy? So, drama and tragedy are a piece of works or art, okay, like a novel or a play, yet there is sadness and sorrow inside that play. Okay, and the best and the most well-known one for writing them all over the course of history was William Shakespeare, of course. But the early Greek people also introduced for us some of the most important tragedy and tragic plays, and also about drama. Like when there is a love story, but this love story ends in sadness or ends in sorrow. When someone gets to fall in love with someone who cannot be with them. Okay, and another stories we do not want to speak about them. So the first Greek plays were held in the festivals honoring the god of wine and fertility, Dionysus. Continue, please. Plays were
Plays were performed in large outdoor theaters with little or no set. Actors wore elaborate costumes and stylized masks. A chorus sang or chanted comments on the action taking place on stage. Greek dramas were often based on popular myths and legends. Through these familiar stories, playwrights discussed moral and social issues or explored the relationship between people and the gods.
all right. So at the beginning of that art or the beginning of plays, they were introduced to the public in large outdoor theaters. Okay, so they will just make the theater outdoor. They will start building it, putting the wood together, and once the stage is completed, all the people gather. Okay, and there are no seats. All the people, the spectators, they are standing and watching the uh, actors performing their play. Yeah, and of course, while performing their play, they usually wore very customized and very stylistic masks. So they did not. It's not like today's theater and plays. Today, you go to a theater, you sit in your chair, and the actor is in front of you wearing simple clothes like any of our clothes. and just start speak. But back then, once they started, they wore specific customs, specific clothes, and very strange masks in order to serve the act of the play, or the purpose of the play. Especially that those plays were played for gods or for the divine or whatever. So they frequently presented gods in their plays. The greatest Athenian playwrights were someone whose name is Aeschylus and Sophocles. We have spoken about Sophocles before, right?
No, I don't remember.
Okay, I believe I might perhaps. So we have Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euphrates. Those are the most important figures in the Athenian playwrights. This is important, please. Okay. So we have in the Greek literature, we have the most important poets are Homer, Sappho, and Pindar. And for the Athenian playwright, we have Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euphrates. All three wrote tragedies, plays that told stories of human suffering. So a tragedy is a story that tells us about a human who is suffering and usually ends in disaster, like dying or committing suicide. That is the meaning of tragedy. Then that's important too. The purpose of tragedy, the Greek felt, was to stir up and then relieve the emotions of pity and fear. For example, in the play Aristotle, we have the main character, Achilles, showed a powerful family torn apart by betrayal, murder, and revenge. So, for example, this is one of the stories, and in that story, the main character show us how a family could be torn apart. How can a brother just kill his own brother for taking his money or even his wife, and all of these obstacles and things that can turn a family apart. Murder, betrayal, revenge, you name it. And those were played more often in many of the plays back then, and until the medievals also, the Shakespearean period, the Elizabeth era. Uh, yeah, Queen Elizabeth also until later. All of them were playing about the same point. Like we have Odysseus, there is the play Hamlet. Yeah, by William Shakespeare also speaks about the same thing. How that his uncle killed his father in order to take his place as a king and later married his mother. So most of the tragedy speak about the same thing. Audiences saw how even the powerful could be subject to horrifying misfortune, and how the wrath of the gods could bring down even the greatest heroes. Meaning that, of course, because they were polytheists, they believed in gods and that gods intervened in their own daily affairs. Consequently, a god may intervene in someone's affairs and to bring misfortune for him. Of course, that is not true. It was not Zeus that had published me that edict law. Not such are the laws set. Of course, this is a part of the play. Among men by the justice who dwells with the gods below, nor deemed I that thy decrees were for such force that a mortal could override the unwritten and unfailing status of heaven. This is part of Sophocles' story or play, Antigone. The Antigone, translated by Richard C. Egypt. So, of course, here in this exhibit, we see how they believe that the gods intervened in their actions and that they were suffering a lot. In Antigone, Sophocles explored what happens when an individual's moral duty conflicts with the laws of the state. This is the theme of the play Antigone. Antigone is a young woman whose brother has been killed leading a rebellion. King Creon forbids anyone to bury the traitor's body. When Antigone buries her brothers anyway, she is sentenced to death. She definitely tells Creon that duty to the gods is greater than human law, because in their belief they knew that once a person dies, he must be buried so that his soul will go to their gods. Consequently, she tells him that the duty to the gods is greater than that of a human. Like Sophocles, we have another one, which is Euripides survived the horrors of the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, if you can still remember. That experience probably led him to question many aspects, ideas of his day. His play suggested that people, not the gods, were the cause of the human misfortune and suffering. In the Trojan woman, he tripled war of its glamour by showing the suffering of women who were victims of the war. So far, so good. So simply, all the tragic stories, they all have a common sense, which is suffering and ends in either death or disaster. Another part, of course, is the Greek comedy. So, some Greek playwrights wrote comedies, humorous plays that mock the people or even customs of that city. Almost all the surviving ancient Greek comedies were written by Aristophanes in the book called Lysistrate. He shows that the women of Athens banding together to force their husband to end a war against Sparta. Unlike tragedy, which focused on events of the past, comedies ridiculed the individuals of the day, including political features, of course, philosophers, and prominent members of the society. Throughout, ridicule comic playwrights sharply criticized society much as political cartoonistic do today. So far, so good, guys.
Yes.
Any question?
No.
More than any other art form I've had experience of, Greek tragedy does one particular thing, and that is look suffering, human misery, directly in the face. And it can't stare it down, but it stares at it. No other art form is so unflinching about it.
I think part of the reason that Greek theatre transcends cultural and temporal boundaries is because its themes are so universal that even though it's set in a culture which is very different to our own, the basic themes still speak to us today because they're universal. We still have difficulty with our relationships. We still have to make painful decisions in our own lives, and we still have to grapple with the unfairness of the universe and the fact that people seem to suffer when they don't seem to really deserve to.
The first really important study of Greek tragedy was by a 4th century Greek philosopher called Aristotle. And Aristotle thought for a very, very long time about what made Greek tragedy effective. And he actually came up with a formula, and that is that the heroes of tragedy needed to be good, but not so good that you sort of couldn't relate to them. People trying to be good, but making mistakes, like Creon. He is actually trying to be a good king of thieves. He's just not getting it right. He's making lots of mistakes. Aristotle says that one of the key things that leads to tragedy is what he calls the hamartia, the error of judgment. And tragedy is actually about real people making bad decisions that lead to terrible results. Real people making bad decisions often for good reasons. So tragedy is about the idea that we live in a flawed world, full of suffering, full of injustice and misery. But it also shows us that those things are caused by our actions, and they're therefore remediable by our actions. Almost all the plays actually have someone die in the course of them, and so what we watch is not only their reactions, if they know it's going to happen, and those of the people who are left behind, but even in the ones where people don't actually die, the main characters have a peculiarly intense relationship. They're usually held in the grip of the past somehow through their dialogue with the dead. Many characters in Greek tragedy who know they're about to die or fear they're about to die address the sun. One of the strongest metaphors for death for the ancient Greeks was, I'm going to leave the light, or I will never look upon the sun again. That means I will die, because they believed that after death they were consigned to this dark netherworld beneath the earth.
Greek tragedy is a very stylized genre, and its structure is relatively fixed. It always starts with a prologue which sets the scene. After that, then the chorus come on and sing an introductory ode, which both comment on the previous scene, but also allow for the passing of time. So a choral ode might only last 5 minutes, but the audience can imagine that perhaps several hours have gone by, and so something important off stage can have happened during that time.
One of the real innovations made by the Greek tragedians in literature is in the way they constructed their plots. What they learnt to do over that 80 years was make everything happen in their plays in less than the time between a sunrise and a sunset. So you get this very, very, very skillful writing that means you can unravel many, many, many things that have led to this disaster, and often much of the future if the god comes along and gives you some predictions, all concentrated into this tight action of a single day. That has had an unimaginable impact on the future of dramatic writing. It's difficult to underestimate the impact of Greek theatre on the theatre in Europe has developed in the years since, really, especially since the Renaissance. There are modern playwrights who do deliberately attempt to use the structures and ideas of Greek tragedy. I mean, most famously, I suppose, the American playwright Arthur Miller deliberately sets out in plays like Death of a Salesman to copy the structure of a Greek tragedy and follow it through. In many ways, I think that the modern form of entertainment that uses the same kind of material as ancient Greek tragedy, rather astonishingly, is soap opera. The actual plots of soap opera, which are set very much in the community, you have the community reaction, involve these close family dramas. We often have two brothers fighting. You very often have tragic and unexplained deaths. You have inappropriate sex. The affair is the absolute staple. You have powerful matriarchs. You have illegitimacy. So they carry on having their impact in our most popular form of entertainment. Aristotle talks about a thing called Caphasis, which in ancient Greek means cleansing or purifying. And he says that when we watch the end of a tragedy, we feel pity and fear, and those emotions get purged, they get cleansed in some sense.
What he probably means by that is the sense of emotional draining, that the experience of watching a play somehow purges you of all your emotions, and that it's a cleansing process, that it's traumatic, but it's also a good experience, that you come out of it perhaps feeling drained. And I think anybody who's ever burst into tears at the end of a movie knows you can actually feel better for that. If it gets in touch with some sort of strong emotion in you about, oh, I really hope that doesn't happen to me, or that poor woman, weeping over it can actually rather paradoxically strengthen you. That's what catharsis is. Tragedy is about confronting suffering, death, mourning,
loss, all of these things. What it does is it enables us to find reflections of our own lives and see that these feelings and ideas are shared. These feelings and ideas are part of a community. They're part of a tradition.
Alright, grade 9. Any question about the early Greek tragedy?
No, thank you.
Okay, you may have the rest of the session now. And have a nice day, grade 9. See you tomorrow. And by the way, tomorrow you have a presentation.
So we should do it today for tomorrow?